Welcome to Everyday Torah. My name is Traver, and I have got Gary with me again. We finished up that Melchizedek series, Gary, and took a little break because it actually does take quite a lot of time. And
it sure does. Yeah.
It does. And it was nice to have our Sunday mornings back for a little while.
Yeah.
And I did have one subscriber ask, where are you in the process of the Melchizedek book? Have you finished the manuscript at this point?
I'm almost completed with the draft. Very little left on the draft. So I'm at that stage now where the content is pretty well fixed somewhat.
Yeah.
I'm a little fluid on that, but basically, I'm actually kind of pleased with the first draft, but I know it still needs some work because the key now is to get it into a format that people will actually want to read it.
Well, that's true. Well, hey, let me be.
You know how that is.
I do. I know editing takes a while. But, goodness, let me be one of your outside readers.
All right, I will.
Wraps.
I definitely would like to have you review it, and I have some other people in mind as well, both professionals and non-professionals, because I like to get a take on how the communication part of it's going. I want it to be technically sound, but also readable. Trying to find that balance.
I think getting to the last page for people would be certainly helpful, and it is. Yeah. There's a lot of technical stuff in this.
Yes, there is. Yeah.
Well, so today we are taking a look at Colossians chapter 2, verses 16 and 17. Gary, I did a video on this a little while.
Yeah, it's very nice.
A little while back.
I enjoyed it. Yeah.
Well, I think I'm going to enjoy today more, and let me tell our listeners why. And that is, even though you and I drew the same conclusion, I think yours is the elegant solution.
Yeah.
Where I think you unpack the grammar and the actual outcome in the end. When I read it and after looking through the argument, I think this makes sense. And so I want to tell the listener that this is going to be a technical video, but the thing is, if you stay with it, it actually is not complicated. It's one word. It's a conjunction. And how we treat that conjunction in Greek is a really big deal and changes quite a lot. So
it does. Yes.
Anyway, Gary, give us the floor and tell us about this verse and what's the issue.
All righty. Well, thank you for that. Yes, the book of Colossians is a fascinating epistle of Paul's. The more I get into it, the more I feel like this is really an important book. Sometimes we elevate, his epistles. Romans we know is a great work. Hebrews, if he wrote it, and I believe he did, another one. Those are sort of timeless works in some ways. But I enjoy getting into some of his epistles which deal with real problems that are facing the congregations and how he manages those. And so when we look at the book of Colossians, like anything else, the context is critical, number one. And although I have been looking at this passage for a number of years and have taught on it over many years, and I'm happy to say taught apparently correctly on it, that because the things that I shared in the past were very much in line with what we're going to share today, except I was missing a critical piece of the puzzle. I scratch my head over the years and think about what it was about that passage that always struck me as not quite right the way it was rendered, the way it was translated by the translators. And I concluded that context was the key to understanding it. And I had to make my arguments on a contextual basis, looking at Colossians. What is Colossians talking about? What is it really, what is it pointing us toward? And as well as some greater issues of context about Paul generally, and even about the nature of the New Testament church, which, of course, we've only understand, I think, in part, but as time goes on, we're understanding it better and better. And I think understanding the nature in the New Testament church helps immensely when we come to try to unravel, shall we say, a more controversial passage in the New Testament.
So I'm going to create a bibliographic reference for the Troy Martin article below.
Yeah, and I want to acknowledge his article because it was fantastic. I mean, it's rare that I read an article that I just enjoy reading because it's technically sound and it's very readable and it explains things well, and it actually stimulated my own thoughts on a number of related issues in that passage. It does everything that I think a good scholarly article should do, and it's very readable, as I think you would attest. It's a very readable article, even if you don't know Greek. It's fairly readable.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those are the kinds of things we do want to highlight, and I want to give him a lot of credit for that article. It was immensely helpful. Yeah. Yeah,
for me too. And I am interested, even in your presentation, to see how you will describe ellipses. So a listener, you'll have to read the Troy Martin article, but will you bring in ellipses and how?
Yeah, a little bit. Yeah, we'll talk a little bit about that because it's important actually to the argument. So I have to say something about it. Yeah.
All right. Okay.
Yeah. So let me just briefly start with a quotation of the passage, and then I'll say a few more introductory remarks, and then we'll get right into the technical parts.
Okay.
So Colossians 2:16-17, I entitled this, Correcting a Centuries Old, and I mean centuries old, misunderstanding and mistranslation. Now, this is really significant because as we work through the argument, as you pointed out in your introductory remarks, which were very good, by the way, and helpful, I believe that we have to understand that the resolution to this problem is amazingly simple. It's amazingly simple once you understand the problem. So once you understand the problem, it's almost a slam dunk no-brainer. I mean, honestly, it's just like, wow. And yet the translators almost universally have gotten this wrong. And you ask yourself, what is with that? What's going on? I mean, that's kind of an amazing thing. I mean, and they've been getting it wrong for a very long time, and they're still getting it wrong, even in the most recent translations of this passage. They still haven't awakened to the fact that there's a serious grammatical problem in what they're doing with this passage. So, and the other part of this is actually the fact that this passage is used frequently by people. It comes up. It's on the short list of those passages that people want to use to discourage people from certain kinds of observances and practices. And in fact, just 2 weeks ago, Sharon has been part of a year-long Bible study on Zoom in the Old Testament with a fairly well-known ministry that operates it. And a question arose because people are going through the Old Testament. They ask a question like, well, should we be as Christians, observing these things, like Sabbath and some of the festivals and things of this nature? And of course, the teacher comes back with 2 passages. And this was one of them. This is one of them. It is one of the biggies in this argument, and it's funny because it's not one that really slams the observances in a direct way. It's a little more like, from their take on the passage, a little more indirect, but it's very clear that people believe, at least, that this passage is kind of denigrating, discounting, diminishing, discouraging people from thoughtful consideration of these observances and what they could mean to the believer. And that was the case, sadly, in my wife's experience recently. So it just, to me, and there was another thing I'll tell you about later in the podcast as well that happened just this week that was, again, related to this passage. And I thought, well, maybe, the Lord is saying something here. Maybe this has become a very timely subject for us to address. So what I'll do is I'll go through, let me just go on and quote the passage for people. Since we've been talking about it, and they'll know what we're talking about. And I'm using the New King James Version. It's a word for word, and it's pretty good. As translations go, this would rank as one of the better ones, definitely, maybe up near the top. And I think it renders most of the two verses very, very adequately. But there is a problem, and that problem is right at the end of the passage where the controversy begins. So in verse 16 in chapter 2 of Colossians, it says, "So let no one judge you in food or in drink or regarding a festival or a new moon or Sabbaths, which are a shadow of things to come, but the substance is of Christ." And I've highlighted the last phrase in blue on my slide so that people would take note. Okay, this is the problem area, the substances of Christ. Now, let me just say at the outset that I'm perfectly in harmony with the sentiment of what that is saying as translated. The observances are in fact shadows, and they in fact foreshadow things to come. You could translate it that way and at least be, even though it wouldn't be technically in line with the Greek, to translate it as a foreshadow, or maybe it would. Foreshadow, if you say it that way, I guess. They are a foreshadow of things to come would be okay. But that's what they do. They foreshadow these things about Yeshua, about Messiah. Who is he? What is he? What is his mission? What is he doing? And we've talked a lot about that in previous podcasts. So that sentiment and Messiah is obviously the thing that is being pointed to by all of these things. They're pointing to him. And so that's clear. And so this passage, the sentiment of it, as it's rendered in most translations, is perfectly fine, and I would agree with. Mm-hmm. Problem is, it's not the correct translation. It's wrong. It's wrong. And then we get into an interesting problem of, well, how can this happen? Why is it wrong? What's going on with this particular passage? And it raises, I think, a lot of interesting, larger questions. And so I'm going to go on to, I'm working from some slides here, and so I'm going to the next one now. And the third slide is on what I just titled it our thesis. and I'm going to claim the following, that almost all translations of this passage follow the same methods in reaching this particular rendering or one very similar. If you look at the translations, as we hopefully will have time to do later, a little survey of them, you'll see that. You'll see that they're all kind of similar, basically the same thing in different words. But this translation tradition, not just the translation, but there's something underlying it that's causing everyone to get it wrong. This tradition is simply and demonstrably wrong. And further, I claim, betrays a terrible bias coming from the translators. They have a bias. And it's a bias that is pretty universal. I mean, this one's deeply rooted. And just to pause there for a moment, that's something that should bother people, I think. That really should bother people. People should scratch their heads and go, if what I'm saying is true, this is a big deal. Irrespective of what the verse ultimately means. Just on that alone, it is an important question for us to tackle. I will show that this translation and all such similar renderings violate an important grammar rule of the Koine Greek. The Koine Greek is the ancient Greek that was used in the New Testament, and expose a misunderstanding of the context of the Epistle of Colossians as well as the very nature of the New Testament church.
Gary, as you're switching slides there, if you could turn down the red box volume just a tiny bit.
Just a tiny bit? Okay.
Yeah, just a tiny bit.
Okay, how's that?
Perfect.
Good.
Thank you.
So we'll begin with the proposal for the correct translation that I'm making, and I'm phrasing it in that way so that people know, okay, this is our problem. We're going to look at this problem and see if there's a solution to it. And so the most literal sort of word-for-word form, and as you know, with all translations, there's a little wiggle room in how you sometimes express a translation, even in a word-for-word form. But I like to stay as close to the words as possible because I don't want to endanger inserting, adding, or subtracting something from the passage. So in verse 16, I would translate it this way. So let no one judge you in regards to food or eating. You could use eating there too. Or in regards to drink or drinking. So either form is fine. Food, drink, or eating, drinking are essentially equivalent. Can be rendered either way. Or respecting a festival or new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things coming. Pause. No changes of any significance to this point. The translations are certainly the NKJV and most of the word for word, not all, but most of the word for word are pretty good. But now for the change. But let the body of Christ judge, and I'll add you. Let the body of Christ judge you. And that's perfectly appropriate because the you is actually implied there as well. And we're going to see later that both the verb and the direct object pronoun are actually implied in that last statement. But that'll come later. We have to kind of work our way to that point. But that's the translation. And you can already see, wow, that really changes the meaning of the passage, doesn't it? And the answer is yes, it does. It changes it actually kind of radically. It shifts the entire focus of that passage to something quite different than most people would have imagined.
Well, and when you have the substances of Christ, it appears that you're selecting some different words even. Okay.
Yeah. So our goal will be to show why I believe this is the correct translation. And in fact, it actually turns out it's about the only translation you can do for this and obey the grammar. So that's a really strong argument. So if that statement is true, it's not only just a good, viable translation. The claim is, no, it's stronger than that. It's actually really the only one that satisfies all the requirements of the grammar.
Well, I hope Bill Mounts watches this.
Yeah.
Yeah. I don't even know if that guy's alive anymore, but let's just,
yeah.
If this is the epiphany, I'm hoping that someone will watch this that knows their Greek and go, okay, all right.
Yeah. Me too. In fact, I would be most interested in his take on it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So we'll start with the Greek version of the passage, and we have to get a little technical just in this part. It's only for a few minutes, but there are some things, since I'm going to make reference to it, that are important for the viewer and the listener to be aware of as we come to it. So this passage can be divided into 4 clauses. I linked the first 2 kind of together because they naturally go together as a complete sentence, but I'm going to separate them for the time being, and then we'll put them together at the end. So I refer to them as Clause 1a and Clause 1b, respectively, and they are in verse 16. Clause 1a in the Greek is the one that says, don't let anyone judge you. You know, and I'm paraphrasing now a little bit, but just, it's a independent clause. And this is indisputable. Nobody disputes it, and they shouldn't dispute it because an independent clause is one that's kind of a standalone, isn't it? It can form a complete sentence, and this one does. And the Greek words that I'll just point out on the slide here is the ones I highlighted in this sort of maroon color on my slides. May is the first one because it's a negation. It means not. You know, and negative, essentially negation. Tis, which is anyone. And then the verb, this is very important, krineto. Krineto is the word to judge. And it's, by the way, a word that's used very frequently in the New Testament. I think many believers might take note of that. That, you know, in our modern church, with all of the emphasis on thou shalt not judge one another, you know.
Now, Gary, on
this kind of attitude, you know,
for our technical junkies, on the imperative case, is that imperative mood?
Yeah, that's the imperative mood. That's right. Yeah, so it's a tense, and it's an imperative tense that is more or less like a command tense or a very strong admonition. You know, something like that. So if you're you know, in the Army, and your drill sergeant says, do this, that's an imperative, right? You know, that's the idea. It's a very strong verb in this particular tense. And we can render it in the English because we want to, it depends sort of on the wording of the sentence, how you would do this, but generally the sort of idea of let judge is consistent with the imperative tense. So it's often rendered something like that in the English translations, but it's strong. And that's one thing I want to emphasize. This is a strong word. It's a strong word here.
Yep.
So we have those 3 words, and it says, not therefore anyone you let judge. There I'm reading it as you would transliterate it directly from the Greek, but it gives you a sense of, oh yeah, there's some word order issues here, but those are not a problem. Fortunately, the word order is very different often in Greek than English, but it's usually easily sorted out. And so the translation is fine. The important point is independent. It's an independent clause. Now, clause 1b, the relative clause to Clause 1A. I use C here just as an abbreviation for clause, C1A, and this is also indisputable. It's very clear. If you look at I won't read this one because it's a little bit long, but it's talking about what I like to call the sort of laundry list, if you will, of all of the practices that are coming under discussion here.
Mm-hmm.
So it mentions food and drink and feast days, new moons and Sabbaths, and one can see the translation of the various words. And it's actually a fairly simple clause, right? It's just, it's food and drink or Sabbaths and new moons and things of this nature. It's a fairly simple rendering. So it's straightforward as well. And it explains what is the matter over which people are judging you. That's basically what it's there for. Okay, so we'll move on to Clause 2. Now, this clause is relative to Clause 1B. So it's interesting that we have a little bit of a cascade here, a chain. We have 1B relating to 1A and 2 relating to 1B, basically. And we see this in the very first word, in the Greek letter alpha there, which has a hard breathing mark, I believe, which is translated which, okay. Which is or are, and that's an interesting issue, which I won't get into. Why is it plural or singular there? But we'll just skip that one for now. It's a little involved. But which are or is a shadow, skia, of the things, melanton, of the things coming. That would be an actual perfect rendering, but you can also, in the English, you would be permitted to translate it as well, to come. That would, that's acceptable, but probably coming is the purest form of the translation there. So again, no problem with it. The relationship as a relative clause is indisputable. And in fact, if you look at it really in its context, and you'll see this later as we look at the entire passage, this is actually a parenthetical statement. So this statement is the one that gets a lot of the focus in this verse, right? Because most people believe that the third clause references back to clause 2. But in fact, you could eliminate this clause from the sentence, from the passage, and it would make no difference in the rendering whatsoever. It's completely, in that sense, grammatically speaking, superfluous, even though on a content level, it is supplying some additional information. So there's no problem with that. So now we're to clause 3. And clause 3, the real issue here is clause 3 relative to clause 2? Is it, in other words, referencing back to clause 2? Or is it independent and thereby, and this is the critical point, thereby must link to clause 1A? That's the issue. In a nutshell, that's it. So which is it? Overwhelmingly, with relatively few exceptions, the translators have chosen to reference it to clause 2. And is that correct? It could be. And it could be, it could be either possibility is possible. And so we have to look at that. However, as Dr. Martin pointed out in his paper, and it's been actually pointed out by some others, which I'll show you in a moment, that the key to unraveling this whole mystery is in that simple 2-letter word, delta epsilon. If you look down below there, it's in red, and it's the Greek letters for our corresponding English letters, D and E. You'll sometimes see it transliterated that way. De or de. It's kind of, the vowel is a little bit, I think people pronounce it a little differently, but it's a very simple, just one syllable, right?
Yeah.
Word.
Day.
Yeah.
Well, I'll tell you, all the difference right there.
Yeah. All the difference. Everything hinges on that little word, that mighty little word, 2-letter word. It's all there. And because, in fact, that word has a special function in the Greek language. It's not just a normal conjunction. It has special uses that it has in the Greek, and so that has to be understood and obeyed. So here it's today, soma, tu Christou. Very simple. That's but the body of Christ, okay, is how it's rendered in many translations in its purest sense, adding no words. However, and this is where we get into the ellipsis you asked about earlier, there is a a place in the Greek to add verbs to phrases, and they can be inserted, particularly where it's needed. And so many statements in Greek carry a kind of an implication of a verb being there, even though it's not written. It's kind of interesting. Greek does this, but they do it, and it's been long recognized that this is done, and this is at least one of the reasons why translators will occasionally insert words. They do it for other reasons as well, but often they have to put a verb in a phrase for it to be sensible as an English sentence. And so this is what's happening here, and it's perfectly fine to insert the verb. My contention will be they've inserted the wrong verb. However, as we'll see, is an appropriate verb to insert in most circumstances, just not in this one. And so that's what we're going to talk about, and we're going to see that when you do insert the verb, if you read the phrase just as it's written in the Greek, but the body of Christ, that's incomplete. That's clearly relative. There's as a standalone, it wouldn't work. But if you add the verb, but the body is of Christ, it changes it, doesn't it?
It does.
It's no longer it's no longer dependent. It's a standalone phrase. And that's critical to our argument. So let me summarize the clauses here, because I want to show you with all the clauses delineated, and now I'm back into the English.
Mm-hmm.
So let no one judge you, independent, clause 1A, okay? No problem. In regards to food, or in regards to drink, or respecting a festival, or new moon, or Sabbath. Dependent, referencing back to clause 1, okay? Clause 2, 1A, pardon me. Clause 2, which are a shadow of things coming. Again, dependent. This case on the previous clause, because it's referencing back to the members of the list that are given in clause 1B. Clause 3, but the body is of Christ. Whoops, wait a minute. Now what do we have? What do we have here? What we have here is now an independent clause with that verb inserted. You see that? So if I put that verb in there, it's independent, okay? So why is that a problem? It's because the conjunction used, de, cannot link an independent clause to a dependent clause, to a relative clause. That means technically you cannot link clause 3 to either 2 or 1B. That's it. Rule of grammar, sorry.
Okay, so this is a rule of Greek
grammar.
You cannot do that.
Cannot do this. So, this day, as I mentioned earlier, is special. It is a what's called a coordinating conjunction, generally translated and, but, however, other similar words can be used sometimes. And the key to the whole problem is it's has a very specialized function in the Greek grammar. So what is that function? Well, there's three aspects that I want to point out. The first one's probably the most important, and the second and third are what I would consider auxiliary, but definitely important. They're generally true, and they must be kept in mind when you use this this conjunction, as I understand it. This conjunction must link clauses of the same kind. That is, independent to independent, relative to relative. So if it remained a relative clause, you might have some cause to say, okay, maybe we connect it with clause 2. It doesn't really connect with clause 1B, so it's usually the decision is between 2 or the very first clause, which I'm calling 1A. So that's the first thing, absolute rule of the grammar. The second point that I want to bring, the second fact, is in its most usual application, it is contrasting in nature. And in our case here, we'll contrast, as we'll argue, a positive imperative to a negative one, and it can do vice versa, apparently, to create what's called an antithetical comparison. So what you have is, you want to think of it as, you have these two statements, and in a sense, I always like to think of it as they're kind of like at war with one another, and we have to bring resolution to them. In this case, there's two commands. It's like, don't do this, but do this. And so there's a tension there, and you have to bring things into proper order and balance. That's the second thing that it does. The third thing is, although you can have is be used anytime as an ellipsis, is in a category of what's called a linking verb, and you have a lot of latitude in the Greek, where you use that and how you use it in Greek sentences. So often putting it into a sentence can be the right thing to do, but not always. And here, what I'm going to argue is that the day is also required to use the same verb that's in the sentence it's linking to. So let me take you back just for a moment so you can see what we're talking about. If it does, in fact, link to clause 2, if it were to do that, there is a verb in clause 2. It's are or is, and you could link to that. So that's where the is would be appropriate. But if it's to clause 1a, the first clause, the verb is the imperative case of judge. It must link to that, and it must use that verb, because that's what it does. It brings the presentation of a verb in one format, and in another case, first one's negative, that next one's positive in nature, and it's bringing them together. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
into an appropriate, I'll just use the term balance, kind of like a teeter-totter, kind of balancing it out. All right, so that's what it's doing. That's its function. That's its function. That appears to be what that conjunction was designed to do. If you want to say it that way, it was designed. I often wonder in listics what gets designed and what doesn't get designed. But
right.
The rules of grammar evolve over time, and there's conventions that get established in languages for this reason, that you have sometimes words that are set aside for specific purposes, and this seems to be the case for day. So this week I was reading something. I've always been a fan, and I've read a great deal, by the way, of Abraham Lincoln's works. I've read almost all of his speeches. I've gone through, I've just had a passion to understand him more, because I think he's one of the most unique figures in American history. He kind of ranks up there, obviously, with Washington and some of the other greats of our country. And I've been very interested in his addresses, and I got a book recently on the Gettysburg Address, and this book was highly recommended as giving a very fine discussion of just the aspects of that address that made it so profound. It's a profound address. I mean, there's probably been anything rarely given like it in the history, certainly of our country, and maybe in Western civilization. I mean, that much. And here, the book, it was Lincoln at Gettysburg, The Words That Remade America by Gary Wills. And Wills is he's a classicist. He knows his Greek. And he has a whole chapter on the Greek oratory tradition and how it influenced Lincoln's speech. So that's the chapter.
Oh, I know. I saw this quote in your presentation.
Yeah.
These people are so smart.
Yeah. They are. I know. It's very readable, but it has its points of erudition, shall we say? And he's getting into some pretty serious issues. So I came across this passage just this week. I mean, it was again a timing issue that I thought, well, isn't this timely that I would read this from a completely unrelated source?
Yeah.
And be able to have it fit right into what we're talking about. So I'll just quote it for you and just make a few comments to maybe I might have to explain a little bit here, but a lot of it I think will be pretty clear. He says, nothing marked Greek literature more than its use. Nothing marked Greek literature more than its use. Now, stop there. That means what we're going to talk about is used a lot, right? It's really, that's, in fact, he even goes on to say in almost every sentence, what? What we're going to be talking about is really a hallmark of Greek. This is what this man is saying. Right.
What your claim is with regard to what Paul is doing in Colossians 2. It's not like this is an anomaly or something.
That's right. This is like bread and butter. This is like, you do this all the time.
Yeah.
Kind of stuff, right? In almost every sentence of the polarizing particles, that's an important word.
Mhm.
Men and day. Those are the two Greek words, men. It's kind of related to day, but they don't serve quite the same function. It's a nuance. It's a little bit different, but these appear very frequently and in the Greek language. And what do? They do not spell out, or they do not crudely spell out, is his term for it, on the one hand or on the other. When you're making an argument, very often philosophers especially, right? They get together in the Greek tradition. What do they do? Well, on the one hand, this, but on the other hand, that,
Right.
and they're going back and forth. It does kind of do that, but that's kind of a crude explanation he's claiming for what this does. Rather, men serves to prepare for a contrast of greater or less sharpness. What he's saying is men is kind of used for very subtle distinctions that you're trying to draw out, in the Greek. But he says, which the particle day, by contrast, provides as a balancing adversative to the first. So that second one, I'm sort of keen on the balancing adversative, but I'm going to argue that what he's talking about there is it's the very things that we talked about just a few moments ago.
Right.
It's like day is polarizing by its very nature because it deals with connecting polarizing things, right? Mm-hmm. You have a don't and a do. It's like, okay, so there's a do not versus do. That's polarizing. That's like negative, positive. That's like darkness and light, right? Mm-hmm. That's like good and evil, if you want to go to, right. another non-couplet, right? See, in other words, it's dealing with adversatives that you now have to bring a balance or understanding to. That's really what it's doing. So it's connecting specific things. That's the point. And that's what this gentleman was arguing, and I thought, wow, it was really neat to see this in application in a completely different context than the New Testament Greek, and they're saying the same thing. Well, so
I give my applause to Gary Wills for pointing this out.
Yes. Well, he was pretty serious. And by the way, in his arguments, he does a very strong case that indeed Lincoln was following the Greek oratory tradition. His talk, that bloomed very much in his mind as he was framing that address. And it goes to show you, because there's some traditions about how quickly it was written. It was written relatively quickly. Some people feel maybe even on the train over, but probably he started it maybe just before he got on the train. Because I think drafts were seen by a few people before the day of. But it's amazing when you think about these orators, and I become very interested in oratory because I think it's a lost art now, and people have not understood how powerful the address was. Something like 72 words or something like that. I mean, can you imagine? And it's going to be an address that people remember forever. I mean, think about that. That's the power of oratory. The right thing said, the simple, to the point, but stated in such artistic manner, if I can use that term, that's so clear and so insightful that it's memorable. And many people have memorized this speech because actually it's not that hard to remember because it's so well written. It's so well written and it's not that hard to remember. So so that's why I was kind of interested in it, and it's fascinating. So anyway, going on. So finding the connection for clause 3, then, what we're basically saying, just to kind of refine the argument further, and we'll go through a couple iterations of this because I want people to really get this point. If one wishes to connect clause 2 with clause 3 using day, both clauses must be relative since 2 is clearly relative and indeed parenthetical. This connection works if clause 3 is written without an inserted verb. So if you don't insert the verb, then, we're talking a different thing here. But here's the problem. As we saw it just moments ago, the inserted verb is absolutely required for this passage to make sense, which is why the Greek translators insert a verb there, because they know it doesn't really fit in anywhere quite. It almost fits in with clause 1a. And in fact, this is kind of interesting. So let me just divert you back there just for a moment to go back a few slides to the summary of the clauses. So that's slide 7 for your point.
Yeah.
If you read it, clause 1a So let no one judge you. Let me skip then down to 3. So let no one judge you, but the body of Christ. You can almost make that work, can't you?
Yeah.
Saying it, you can almost make that work. In other words, you almost don't need the verb there because the implication is so strong, right? Let no one judge you, but the body of Christ. Mm-hmm. And in speaking, because of the way we can inflect things with our speaking, we can sometimes make things that when they're written don't look like they would fit because we're adding the dimension of the inflection to it. Mm-hmm. But in a written text, it's hard to do that, right? Even anciently, it was really hard to do it because their style of writing was very limited, much more than even today. So I wanted to mention that because there's a natural, I think, because of this, there's already a natural affinity between clause 1A and 3. There's already a natural affinity. You could even speak it and it makes sense. But technically, you should write the verb in there. And so when you do that, then you see we have an independent clause, and it can only connect, again, back to that independent clause of clause 1A. And so that's what we're talking about. It doesn't really fit, certainly, with either clause 1B or 2. Without, you've got to have the verb. And so that's the first thing. Adding the inserted verb, such as is, makes 3 an independent clause, or for that matter, I say is there because that's what most translators do, but any verb you put in there will make an independent clause. But this makes it now grammatically incorrect to use day to link clause 3 to clause 2 because you're not changing clause 2. It's just there, and it's a relative clause. All right. And the third point, I won't go much into, but it's just simply that we've been through this, but you can't really make it fit in. Just try it. I would ask the audience, if you're interested in this, come back and see the video. If you're just getting the audio, look at this again, and I dare you, try to make it work with some other clause, and you'll find that it won't. And if you think you have, write me, and I'll get back to you and show you where you went wrong. So, but try it. I really encourage you. Try it if you don't believe it. All right. So what this means then, our deduction is this. What we can conclude is that clause 3 can only link to clause 1A. No other option is possible in order to follow the rule of grammar for day, linking independent clause to independent clause. And as we alluded to earlier, the implication's strong for this because this completely changes the primary meaning of the sentence. So the way people have been using this verse, and Sharon just experienced it recently herself, in her Bible study, is wrong. It's not what the verse is saying at all. We have already ruled out clause 2 for connection to clause 3 because the result is either unintelligible or you have to violate a grammatical rule regarding the conjunction day. Because day must also be contrasting, and especially for use with imperative verbs, this would even be more important than it is. As we have here in this passage, the inserted verb form in C3, clause 3, must be the imperative form of the verb, which is chroneto. See, that's the verb one should use. Okay. From clause 1A, but now understood in its positive sense and not its negative sense. Only this solution satisfies properly all the rules of grammar and creates a sensible sentence. See, I can actually follow all 3 rules, and especially the most important being the first rule that I stated to you earlier with this translation, and that's big. That is a big deal. I mean, because when you're talking about grammar, like I said, grammar is pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of wiggle room. You sometimes have a little wiggle room with grammar, but very often it's definitive. It certainly narrows the possibilities a lot, and in some cases, like this one, actually fixes it on only a singular possibility. So again, giving the summary of the clauses so you can see it, so let no one judge you in regards to food, in regards to drink, or respecting a festival or new moon or Sabbath, which are a shadow of things coming, but let the body of Christ judge you. So the reference here from clause 3 is back to the judging aspect and who's doing the judging. That's really what it's talking about. There apparently in Colossae, and there's very good evidence for this, that there were outside influences, and there might have been some inside as well, by the way. But there's certainly predominantly, we'll call them outsiders, but we allow for the fact that there could have been some people who were members of the body too, who were being influenced by these outsiders in some fashion, who were attempting to pass judgment on the community for certain practices. And Paul is basically adjourning the Colossae community to say, no, that's improper. You don't let anybody do that. Let the body of Christ judge. Let the community make those determinations. You see, that's what he's really talking about here.
Yeah.
And in fact, we can even refer back to another letter of Paul, 1 Corinthians chapter 6. Let's look at it. What does it say? Here's two brothers in the congregation. One has defrauded the other. So what does the guy do? He's taking the matter to a Greek court. He's taking him to court. A fellow believer. Paul says, are you kidding me? You're not to do that. Aren't there men in the congregation who can judge this matter?
Yeah.
Here we had a case of fraud, and Paul is adjuring the Corinthian congregation, don't you have men, godly men, men of the members of the body of Christ who have been established and elevated into this position for this very purpose, to address such matters and bring resolution to them without going to an outside court? He's talking here about a matter that could be prosecuted in some forum, and they are to be judged. And certainly when you think about the practices, the observances in a local community, that must be something that is handled by the authorities of that community. And Paul is very consistent on this kind of thing. So you can look at this passage and you can see immediately, oh my, Paul's not talking about some big, abstract philosophical concept about how the festivals point people to Messiah, which they do. No, he has another agenda in mind. And in fact, if you look in the entire book of Colossae, he's having to deal with a number of issues that are coming up from people outside the community, inserting themselves in some form or fashion on the community. That's the entire context of Colossians. And you'll see that in the first chapters, especially in chapters 1 and 2, and a little bit in 3. So it's very important for people to understand the context here, because it just further strengthens and bolsters, I think, our conclusion.
So is all Paul's saying is, hey, don't let outsiders judge you with regard to these things.
Yes.
And if there is some discrepancy in these matters or whatever, let these elders judge.
Correct.
Let the body of Messiah.
That is absolutely right. That's absolutely right. That's what he's talking about.
It's kind of simple.
It's kind of simple, isn't it? Yeah. Yeah, it's kind of simple. And of course, that means now, well, at the very least, an honest person would have to say, well, if that's the true translation, then this passage really is not a very strong passage to be saying the kinds of things that people are claiming it says, is it?
It is not.
It is not. It is not at all. And in fact, it might even could be interpreted to be the opposite, because obviously, if the elders are judging on these matters, then it means they're still important. They're still, at some level, they're a part of what the congregation is probably doing, right?
Yeah.
Because when you use the term in regards to it, it means what's happening is there's somebody criticizing people maybe for how they're doing it. Are they serious enough? Are they doing it the right way? That kind of thing. I mean, that's much more of an imaginable scenario than whether the question was, well, should we be doing them at all? Because that would have been easy for Paul to dismiss. If Paul wanted to say, oh, you guys don't need to worry about this. You think Paul would have been bashful about just coming out and saying that? He would have said, well, you guys, no, forget that stuff. That's not important now. He would have had no trouble saying that if that's what he intended to say, but he doesn't. He couches it in a very different way that lends one to the idea that, well, wait a minute, if we're having elders give rulings and understandings about these observances, that means they still held some degree of importance to that community. That's really what it's saying.
Sometimes I tell folks that, they'll say to me, I wish there was just a few more words inserted into the Greek or whatever. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And why wouldn't Paul do that? Now, I'm talking now uninspired part of Paul, where Paul's just writing. And I think to myself, I think you have to understand that Paul would have never imagined that anyone would have thought to think about what he is saying in terms of getting rid of the Torah.
Yes.
He wouldn't.
That's right.
Just as a human man, he would not have thought that. Or I think as a human, he might have said, I probably, for people in the year 2022, probably should insert a few more words here. But he doesn't have that back then.
That's right. That's right. That's exactly right. And it was unthinkable. It was unthinkable. And the more you learn about Paul, the man, as he's revealed in his own writings and in the book of Acts, the more an honest person, I believe, would come to that conclusion that he was a very observant Jew. And we've talked about a lot of things, about his, I mean, my gosh, the man took a Nazirite vow for probably 5 years.
Right in there.
For 5 years. I mean, this is serious business here. A guy doing that is not anti-Torah, No way. Impossible. And people know that, which is why they don't like to talk about these subjects. True. Because they know if you really dig in and you really get down to understanding what was going on, it's going to blow to smithereens your little preconceived ideas that you have about the New Testament.
But Gary, to the Jews, he was a Jew, and so he played the little part. So that,
but he didn't have to take a Nazirite vow.
I know
there was nothing. There was nobody pushing him to do that.
Yeah,
that was a decision that he did on his own.
Yeah,
in his relationship with God.
Yeah.
So the other things that just mentioned, that the clauses, of course, are contrasting. And they are antithetical, as we've pointed out. So they meet all those requirements, and we'll just go on since we've already talked about this stuff. And so that concludes the technical part. And now I want to, except for one last thing that I'll just point out to your audience here that I think they should also keep in mind, because it does relate back to the question of context, and it's a special note I have on the Greek word for body, which is soma in the Greek. It's spelled out there on the slide, sigma, omega, mu, and alpha. It's a very common word in the Greek New Testament. It's one of those words that are on the short list of the most frequently used words, in the New Testament. And knowing that, note this. It's translated substance or reality, whatever other word you want to use there, basically conveys that idea, only once in the New Testament, and it is in this verse. Only once.
And do you have any idea, other than them, the bias that would cause them to do that?
It's hard for me to come up with one, to be honest. It really is. It really is. And in fact, if you look in Colossians in chapter 1, verses 18 and 24, chapter 2, verses 19, which, by the way, is only 2 verses later, right? This one, chapter 3, verse 15, not only is the word soma used, and he doesn't use it as soma to Christou, as he does in 2:17, what he does is he just calls it the body, and then he goes on to explain in the verse that he's referring in each one of those verses to the assembly, the congregation of believers. It's indisputable. There's no question about what he's talking about there in those verses. Right. So here we got a verse stuck right in the middle of all these other verses where Paul is talking about the body. And we know in Corinthians and other epistles, he talks about the body all the time in reference to the body of believers. He uses that expression frequently, I think certainly the most of any writer in the New Testament. And so I'm thinking to myself, well, wait a minute. Why would you translate body with that in mind as substance? I mean, certainly the translators had to be aware of how much the body was being used in this other context.
Yeah, right.
And yet they go to substance. Well, they have to make it somehow work or fit with their desire to connect clause 3 to clause 2. That's why.
Yeah, and I do.
So,
I want to insert here that these translators are not trying to be people.
that's right.
Yeah, they're not. They're just trying to make it work. But unfortunately, their theological bias is sometimes unknown to them.
Mm-hmm.
It's known to them, but they just can't imagine a world where Paul would have connected clause 3 back to clause 1.
Right. That's right. That's exactly right. And I would agree, by the way. I don't think there's anything malicious on the part of the translators, by and large. I can't speak for every one of them, but certainly not as a group, not as a tradition.
Yeah.
But you're right. I don't think they can even conceive of it being any other way. And because of that, they just feel that, their role as translators, in addition to rendering words, they have to try to give a sort of an interpretation, if you will, that makes sense to a modern reader, right? That's the struggle.
That's true, but I'll admit that it does bother me that these people are intelligent enough to know that day,
yes,
in its construction, would not allow.
Yes.
So that one bothers me a bit.
That it bothers me too, and I think it does come. One of the things that I think is important to point out, and in fact, let me just do one thing. I'm going to go just real quickly, and then I'll do a wrap. Okay, conclusion.
Perfect.
But I wanted to, because you did a nice job with this, and let's see if I can find I don't know what happens on my screen here. Sometimes I have things that disappear. I had this called up and it's like it disappears somewhere. So let me go ahead and bring it up again because I had to put it on a different
slide.
Yeah. All right. And so I'll do that. And then I just wanted to go through, I did a summary of the translations, and I'll just briefly go down them. I won't spend more than a few minutes on this, unfortunately, because of our time. But I think it's just important for people to be aware of what translators have done with this passage.
Okay.
And I think it does kind of lead us to, it kind of points us to maybe what's underlying this need they have to violate the rule of grammar. Because it is a puzzle. It is a puzzle on a rational basis. This is a puzzle.
Right.
So the New Living Translation, this is not a word for word. I really enjoy those because what did you do is you really get to the heart of what do these guys really want to say? But the word for word guys are limited in what they can do. That's the feeling you get. Yeah. It says, so don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink or for not celebrating certain holy days, new moon ceremonies, or Sabbaths. Notice, for not celebrating. That's not in the text. Added. For these rules, see, these rules are only shadows. This one's common, by the way, to insert the word only there. Let the viewer beware, okay, because that only changes the meaning of the sentence. And it's inserted. It's not there. It doesn't need to be there. It's there because the translators want it there.
Yep.
Christ himself is that reality. The Berean Standard Bible has another one, and I won't go through all of these, but a couple of these I think are interesting. These are a shadow of things to come, just verse 17 here. But the body that casts it belongs to Christ. I think that's at least original. I like that one because of its originality. I think that's sort of, the body that casts it. I almost wonder why the other translators didn't go with that, because in some ways, maybe it just sounds like, that's maybe going a little too far. We have to add a bunch of words there to make it sensible.
Gary, how are they using casts in this instance?
Probably if you imagine light behind the body of Messiah, casting a shadow down on the ground.
Right.
Yeah. So that's how I see it, at least. Okay. I think that's kind of the image. But at least, that one's one you can kind of say, okay, that's original at least.
Yeah.
New American Standard is another word for word. I point this out because this one's a word for word. And it inserts the word only, a shadow. It does. Bad. That's very bad. Amplified. I love the amplified. It's great. Such things are only a shadow of what is to come, and they have only symbolic value.
Oh my gosh.
But the substance, the reality of what is foreshadowed, belongs to Christ. Yeah, you see, this is, to me, when you get to these amplified versions and the Living Translation, you begin to get an insight into what's really motivating this approach to this passage.
Yeah.
You really do.
Oh, viewer, this is a
Yeah.
problem. Like this, if I were to go back to the publisher for the Amplified Bible
Yeah.
and say clearly you have added so many words and obliterated Paul's teaching,
Yes.
and you have twisted the scriptures, they'd likely tell me, sorry, it's just too late.
That's right.
It's already out.
We got Bibles to sell.
And they're deceiving you. They are deceiving you. Okay. Well,
yes. That's right. That's right. Revised Standard Version, only a shadow. So there's another one. I wanted to put those in because they are, pretty good translations overall.
Right.
And if that's not bad enough, we even have tense changes. Tense changes. Now that's serious. I mean, it's one thing to add a word, but tense changes. So here, I'll just read the last part. The Contemporary English Version, these are only a shadow of what was to come.
Mm-hmm.
It's in the present. It's a present active participle.
Yeah.
Present tense.
Their bias,
no was.
That's right. Their bias wants to say that the Torah, the law, was there until Jesus. And
that's
since
right.
it's now in the past, it's no longer relevant for us today.
That's correct.
That's the bias.
That's right. That's the bias. That's the bias. That's what they have to do.
Yep.
These are a shadow of what was to come. Holman Christian Standard. Weymouth. Now this is good. He gets not only one was or were in there, he gets two in there. These were a shadow of things that were soon to come.
Go big or go home.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, let's get this done.
And one of the reasons I wanted to go through the Greek with your audience is in going through this now, you can begin to understand, well, wait a minute. Yeah, I saw the Greek on the screen and it's all lined out. And I didn't see this stuff in there. And that's right. You didn't. It's not there. It's strictly an interpretation of the translator imposed on the text. And the problem is, if the translators did this and they wanted to say, okay, I believe it means this, and you put brackets in or do like the NET Bible does, which I happen to like because almost every verse, they have footnotes on that verse saying why they translated it the way they did. And so you can read the verse, you can go to the footnotes and study it and what they call the translation notes. And then you can understand what they were doing and what motivated. That's at least honest. And it's actually very helpful many, many times. But when you just get a Bible and there's no footnotes, there's nothing that tells you like, well, why is this translated the way it is? And you reading stuff like this, what do you expect most believers to believe?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, I get it all the time. Well, that's not what my Bible says. And my first response is, you're right. That's not what it says. So I understand. I understand the issue that you have. And that's why, people get on to me, why are your podcasts so long or videos long or whatever? I'm like, well, the thing is, they kind of have to be because to unravel all the things that have been done, it takes a little while because people have to trust and learn. And well, any last words, Gary? We're at that hour mark.
Yes. The conclusions that I have, we've been through them, but I did want to maybe say one more thing kind of in conclusion, because we've talked about the grammar issue and what sort of guides the approach of the translators and about the New Testament church and some of the issues that are involved there that people don't understand that actually would bring clarity. And I think if people knew the nature of the New Testament church better, they would not have so easily gone there, shall we say, to the translation that they chose. But there's one other thing that's also important that needs to be pointed out, and one of the reasons I wanted to survey some of those translations, much like you did very well too on your earlier podcast, is that there's something more behind all this that people need to be aware of. The translations of the scripture are really overall very good. I like to say, the 99.9% pure. It's like, hey, you can trust, all but maybe 1 out of 1,000 pretty well. They do a good job. But the problem is it's those 1 out of 1,000. It's that 0.1% you have to be very careful. And sometimes the translations are not this overtly bad, where they're violating a rule of grammar or something like that. Just the way they choose to interpret certain words or whatever, that comes from their own background, their own bias, and so it's very important for people to be aware of that. And here, in some cases, it's not random. There's a high percentage of these sort of controversial passages that do seem to suggest or put a positive light on the Torah, on the Jewish law, if you will, things of that nature. That's just one category. There are others, but that category in particular seems to have more issues associated with it than other passages in the New Testament. And I think that the misunderstanding of this passage, like you alluded to earlier, fundamentally results from flawed assumptions about the nature and character of the church and underlying anti-Semitic attitudes that started creeping into the church, certainly at the end of the first century and no later than the early part of the second century. And they came into the church. And these attitudes eventually affected the entire established church. That's the church, through the Middle Ages, right? Catholicism. Mm-hmm. And in the Reformation, they prevailed. They were still prevailing, and they influenced the Protestant Reformation. So the earliest translations we have into English, for instance, and other modern languages, right, goes back to about that time. And those same attitudes were present. So guess what? The earliest translations were influenced by those attitudes. Right. And they then get perpetuated. Because once something's in the translation, it's pretty hard to root it out, especially if you don't want to root it out. So it's now been 500 years. 500 years. Yeah. And still there are things uncorrected. They should be corrected. Because I think of these attitudes that are prevalent, and people need to be aware of this. They need to understand that there's been something of a sinister nature that has crept into the church. I'm not blaming anybody for that per se. I just think people have been influenced by it.
Sure.
And as you pointed out near the early part of the broadcast, these things keep people from seeing the obvious. It's interesting how groupthink can cause individuals to not see the obvious. Groupthink, and that's what we've got. We've got a lot of groupthink going on here, where everybody has sort of decided there's a consensus. It has to be this way. But the problem is, it isn't that way. And this is a good warning, and I hope that this podcast will encourage and stimulate interest, that people will begin to sit back and take things maybe a little more seriously and soberly, and when they're challenged and confronted with these kinds of things, that they'll take up the challenge and go forward with it, because there's a lot of reward at the end of it if you do that. So that was my.
Our time's about up here, Gary. I just want to say again, thank you to my friends in Boise who originally sent me that article. I'll put the bibliographic entry down below for you. You would think this is rocket science, and it's really just not. So hopefully, if you're able to go back and rewatch it one time, you'll see it's amazingly simple. So anyway, part of all this is not just Greek and grammar. This is about two men who are actually kind of little boys that just want to follow our Father, Abba, who has given us instruction for life so that we might walk in his ways and love him and know him. And that's what we want for you as well. And we want it every day, and that's why we call it Everyday Torah. And we'll see you next time.